I can't tell you how honored I am to introduce Jay Veith to talk to you about his book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colonel Jordan. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having me. What we're going to do for the next 25 minutes or so is I'm going to give you sort of a PowerPoint demonstration, a slideshow, and really talking about 4 major myths of the fall of South Vietnam. As you know, once the U.S. combat forces left, the South Vietnamese were left on their own to face a rather formidable North Vietnamese army. And unfortunately, because the country fell in such a rapid fashion in March and April of 1975, these sort of myths have accrued around the South Vietnamese, and they really sort of played into sort of the sort of poor image that the ARVN and the South Vietnamese had in the United States. So we're going to talk about that. One thing I normally have the slide right here in front of me and can read them, but since I don't have my computer and I have to look back a lot, I apologize. So, as I mentioned, most of the books that have been written about the fall of South Vietnam were written by Americans. And a lot of them came out in the mid-'80s, or written by journalists who may have been Saigon, but they really didn't see what was happening on the ground around the country, and in particular, they didn't see what was happening on the ground in the fighting. And so there's been a couple of English language books written by Vietnamese, and they've been of limited quality. The most well-known one, of course, was from the North Vietnamese commander, General Van Dien Dung, whose book really only covers this late 74, 75 time frame. So what we have here is probably the worst foreign policy disaster of America in the 20th century that has been really only barely covered. And so what I set out to do was to take an in-depth probe of the military events that led to the fall of South Vietnam to figure out exactly what had happened after all you guys had left. Because as everyone tells me, you guys were winning when you were there, right? So, see, exactly. So this view, because of this rapid collapse in 55 days, it just really cemented this image of South Vietnam as this really weak vassal state that was totally propped up by American arms, money, and firepower, and just waiting to be pushed over the first strong gust that came along. Well, that's the accepted view among most historians, but as I try to show in my book, that's not really what happened. And just as a sort of a sidebar, the title of the book, Black April, was actually what the South Vietnamese call the fall of the country, which I thought was a perfect summation of what they call a Tang Tu Den in Vietnamese, which means Black April. It's for them the sort of semi-poetic way of talking about what happened to themselves in the fall of their country. And the worst part of it is that the things that were televised at the end, the riots in Da Nang, people trying to fight their way on the planes, fight their way on their ships, the bloody carnage of the retreat down from the Central Highlands, these just further reinforce this image in American minds of this incompetent South Vietnamese military. And so I really set out to look at that and see if that surface view was true or not. So when I started looking at this, I discovered that it wasn't true. And I'll show in the book, and I'll tell you a little bit about it later, is that from the time the Paris Peace Accords were signed until the US Congress started cutting off the aid in late 1973, the South Vietnamese were essentially winning on the battlefield for a variety of reasons. Most battles they got into, when regular ARVN forces were fighting regular Vietnamese forces, they won. And they won dramatically. They took a couple of lumps themselves in some well-planned ambushes, but for the most part, they won. So as I was writing my book, I was able to take advantage of 3 things. First off, the North Vietnamese have written extensively about the war. I mean, they have written voluminously about the war, to the point where they've released a lot of material that even up to 5 years ago would be considered highly classified, including a couple of compendia of what they would consider cables between the Pullup Bureau, General Giap in Hanoi, and the commanders in the South. So I was able to piece together in a detailed way the first really deep insight into North Vietnamese decision-making over a particular time frame at any point in the war and any point in any historical book that's been published. So not only have they released a lot of material, they've released memoirs, they've released battle studies, they've released unit histories, and so I have a very good friend of mine who actually served in the embassy from 70 to 75. He was a CIA officer who's extremely fluent in Vietnamese, and he was able to translate a lot of this material. So we had a picture-perfect view of the North Vietnamese side. The US government, of course, released almost everything they have on the Vietnam War, so I have an in-depth discussion of what the US government was thinking from the Saigon embassy all the way up to Kissinger and President Ford level. And the South Vietnamese were a little more difficult, mainly because there's nothing for them to give out for primary, what are called primary source documents, but they in turn have also written extensively about the war. They publish a lot of what are called branch magazines. So the Airborne Branch publishes a magazine, the Marine Division, the Air Force, the Navy, the artillery guys, and they've written extensively about the war, and we were able to get a lot of those articles, and I was also able to interview a lot of their guys too and talk to them about precisely what happened on the ground. So, if you piece all these, what I call the perfect type of documentation together, and that's why it took me 10 years to do this, is that what you find out was the collapse of far more complex set of things that happened than this image of this weak vassal state just waiting to be pushed over at the first strong gust of wind. So what are these myths about the fall of North Vietnam? I just mentioned one of them. The first one is the North Vietnamese did not make a decision to launch a military strike until late 1974. We'll prove that to be false. The South Vietnamese military collapsed because they were weak and ineffective. We'll discuss that. The liberals like to talk about how the U.S. aid cuts did not hurt the South Vietnamese military. That's totally incorrect. And lastly, the army put up a little fight and the communists easily rolled into Saigon. Okay, so we're going to talk about those four myths. So the first one, as I mentioned, I covered a lot of materials. I was able to interview General Cao Van Vien, who was the head of the South Vietnamese military before he passed away. I was actually very lucky able to talk to a lot of guys before they passed away, a lot of senior generals. And this gives you some of the different books and articles I got into. Okay, so we also looked into almost 100 communist books, as I mentioned, unit histories, battle studies, things of that nature. This treasure trove of primary source material from the Pullup Bureau down to their commanders in the South, 19 memoirs from key communist participants, and over 55 articles in Vietnamese dealing with battles or interviews with key figures. And there's also been a lot of stuff released in the French and Australian archives. All right, so most people believe, and this is kind of like the first myth, most people think that the North Vietnamese didn't really make a decision. Once they had signed the Paris Peace Accord in January '73, they had not made a decision to militarily attack South Vietnam until late 1974. That is totally incorrect. The South Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, excuse me, actually began, once the Paris Peace Accords were signed, their initial thought was they had taken such a brutal beating on the battlefield in 1972 offensive that they would do what was called political struggle, which essentially meant low-level terrorism, low-level attacks, but essentially propaganda, efforts to drag people into their zone of control, to build up their zone, a political struggle for control in South Vietnam. Eventually, they hoped to win what was called a coalition government. And so, as you can see this last bullet point here, I'm sorry, again, I don't have my slides in front of me. So this is what they were thinking in late January '73. I won't read the slides to you here. They really thought, we're going to give this, it's not give peace a chance, it's more like give us breathing room so we can build up our military forces. And if we can win the political struggle, that's even better. So, they were believing their own propaganda. They thought that the South Vietnamese government was a weak state, and they were expecting it to fall almost immediately. But when it didn't fall, and actually began to strengthen itself internally, they were faced with this difficult propaganda and political question. What do we do now? The South Vietnamese aren't falling into our lap like we thought. So, at that time, in late March of 1973, excuse me, so 2 months after the signing of the Paris Peace Accords, the Pullup Bureau meets. They meet to discuss what are we going to do about South Vietnam. And at this point in time, there's a portion of the Pullup Bureau who wants to continue along the path of political struggle, and there are two guys who want to go back to the military struggle. And those two guys are the two most important guys, Le Duan, who is the first secretary, who is essentially the head of the North Vietnamese government, and Vo Nguyen Giap, who is the commander of the North Vietnamese army. Now, what is interesting about this is, and what we discovered in terms of, as we're doing research, is that Giap had been against the 1968 Tet Offensive and against the 1972 offensive, which no one ever knew. Everyone suspected he was the main architect behind these attacks. In fact, Giap was so against the 68 offensive, he left the country on medical leave to go to Hungary and didn't come back until May of 1968. So Giap at this point in time, though, thinks he didn't want to attack in 68 and 72 because why? You guys are sitting there with all that firepower, and there's just no way the North Vietnamese army could beat you guys. So once all the Americans, all the firepower pulled out, what is he faced with? He now thinks he can win the war. So now he does a 180-degree flip and he goes and supports Lê Duan. We should go back on the military offensive. So at this Pullup Bureau meeting, 2 months after the Paris Peace Accords are signed, the Pullup Bureau makes a decision. They're going to form what they call a central cell, and they've got one job and one job only, and that is come up with a plan to defeat South Vietnam in 2 years. Okay? So while all this publicity is going on right about how the North Vietnamese are trying to find peace, and we're trying to find peace in South Vietnam, in reality the North Vietnamese are secretly beginning a planning to conquer South Vietnam by military force. All right? Now at the same time this is going on, all the way down what's called MR9, which is a lower delta, a guy named Lê Duc Anh, who was a commander down there, actually eventually became president of North Vietnam, or Vietnam in 1997, refuses to back off. The orders at that time were not to conduct attacks. Don't cause any problems, don't cause any ceasefire violations, remain in your post, don't cause attacks. He basically gave Cosvin the finger and said, I'm not doing that, I'm going to continue to attack. And he did. And he got told not once, not twice, but 3 separate times, pull back your forces or else. Well, he didn't do it, and he kept attacking, and because he kept attacking, he pushed the South Vietnamese out of a bunch of outposts. When Giap heard about this in Hanoi, he didn't fire Lê Duc Anh, he promoted him. And that was the tipping point. He could now point to an effort down in South Vietnam and says, look, instead of us sitting back and doing nothing, if we continue to attack, our posture, our battlefield position, our supplies, our strength is increasing. And this outright disobeying of command down in the lower delta helped Giap convince the rest of the Pullup Bureau that they should resume military struggle, planning for military struggle. All right, so the Pullup Bureau holds a meeting in May of 24th, and they take a look at all this stuff that's going on. Giap is startling for attacking South Vietnam, and while there was still a faction of the Pullup Bureau that was for giving the political struggle a push, both Lê Duan and General Giap convinced the rest of the Pullup Bureau to vote with them, and the vote is made to resume military struggle, which means looking for a way to conquer South Vietnam. So within 4 months of the signing of the Paris Peace Accords, the Pullup Bureau has already null and voided them out. And nobody knows it but them. And I'll let you read this quote. So Giap wrote this: nobody thought any longer in terms of respite. The combat, we realized, would drag on. It was, he felt, not possible to stop in mid-journey. And the situation in South Vietnam would pass through a period of instability, and South Vietnam would have both peace and war. So the idea here is to attack at a level that undermines the South Vietnamese but doesn't draw the Americans back in. Do you understand what I'm saying? He's got to make those attacks just strong enough to keep draining the South Vietnamese, while at the same time he's building up his forces but doesn't draw the American bombers back in. And so he's got to do that very carefully across the country. So as it turns out then, that this whole thing down in the Delta with Lê Duc Anh is really not true. Because Lê Duc Anh had told the General Giap and the B-2 front Cosvin that the reason he was continuing attacks was because the ARVN forces were continuing to attack him. They were shelling him, they were pushing into his areas, they were ambushing his soldiers, when in fact that wasn't true at all. It was Lê Duc Anh pushing forward, and the ARVN guys were basically sitting in their outposts doing nothing. So, as you can see, it's pretty obvious that, based on this last quote down at the bottom, that the North Vietnamese really had very little intentions of ever abiding by the terms of the Paris Peace Accords. And in fact, it's not in the book, but I found this out later. I just found here recently a decree by their Central Committee that was going to, it was dated 5 February 1973, to continue infiltration down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Actually increase infiltration on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, even though the Paris Peace Accords specifically prohibited any further infiltration. So even within a week, they were planning on violating the ceasefire and the Paris Peace Accords. Okay, so the second myth. The South Vietnamese were weak and ineffective, and that's why the country fell so quickly. So from January 73 until March 75, when the final offensive began, most ARVN units held their own and generally defeated the Pathan attacks without U.S. air support. Most of the losses they took were small outposts where the North Vietnamese were able to mass battalion on a company, regiment on a battalion, and simply could overwhelm them with firepower and numbers. And in most cases, the low level of attacks, as the North Vietnamese are going to ratchet up the attacks in South Vietnam, most of the times when the South Vietnamese were dug in and waiting for them, they pushed them back no problem. It's the times when the North Vietnamese can mass a significant force on an isolated outpost where they can't get the air power in or can't get the artillery in to support them or reinforcements in, where the North Vietnamese win. But by the summer of '74, when the 8 cuts had hit and the South Vietnamese had to withdraw deeper into their outposts, they had to cut the ammunition supply rate. They were down to 4,105. We'll go into this in more details in a second. 405 rounds a day per gun. The North Vietnamese launched a major offensive to the west of Da Nang at a district called Tung Duc. And they took 2 regiments from the 304th Division and they pushed out a Ranger battalion and they were heading right towards Da Nang. And General Truong up in I Corps had to move the Airborne Division in and block them. But this battle right here is going to be very, very, very key. People always think about Phuc Long as the loss of Phuc Long in December of '74 as the key battle. It's not. We're going to talk about Tung Duc in a second. So again, there's heavy fighting down in 3 Corps. The siege of Duc Way, which is a small town to the west of Saigon, was under siege by a Pavan division. The 3rd Armored Brigade, in sort of a classic armor move, swung behind their lines, cut them off in Cambodia, absolutely destroyed the 5th Division. So all these myths about the South Vietnamese were corrupt and ineffective are flat out not true. And you can see right down here, the ARVN takes 15,000 casualties in I Corps 1974 alone. That to me is not an army that's not fighting. All right, so this Battle of Tung Duc we're going to talk about. So they move 2 regiments from the 304th Division off the ceasefire line in Quang Chi. They swing them all the way down through the hill country, all the way past Hai Van Pass, down to outside of the west of Da Nang. And they attack, and basically it's a stalemate. The airborne push them off one hill, but they can't retake the town. The Pavan can't move forward. It's this battle against the most elite South Vietnamese unit, the Airborne Division, by just one of their regular force units, that convinces the planners in Hanoi that they have now regained parity with the South Vietnamese, that their forces have now regained the strength that they had lost in the '72 offensive in terms of manpower, in terms of artillery effectiveness, in terms of coordination in the battlefield. If they can now stand and fight with South Vietnam's best forces, they have now reached battlefield parity and it's time to make a bigger moves, all right? So what they had done in the summer of '74 was to attack, as I told you before, attack just enough to drain the South Vietnamese, but not enough to get the Americans to come back in. So what they would do is they would attack one area, fight a battle, pull back, attack another area, pull back, attack another area. So they're fighting one at a time instead of concurrently. So now they thought, okay, we're going to plan for the '75 offensive, and now we're going to launch a full-scale invasion, and now we're going to launch attacks concurrently across the country and not one at a time. All right, so I wanted to go into some of the things about the RVNF. As I've told many of my South Vietnamese friends, they certainly were not the second coming of the Waffen-SS or Patton's Third Army, but they certainly were not the weak and ineffective army that they're often portrayed. So I took a look actually at the commanders who were actually commanding from battalion on up, and I actually did a study. And I said, how many of these guys deserted their troops? And as it turned out, there are 50 some odd Ranger battalion commanders and group commanders. Not one single battalion commander deserted their troops. So you added up all the Marines, took the elite units, the Rangers, the Marines, the Airborne, some other ones. As 100 battalion or group or regimental commanders, only 3 guys left their troops, and that was on the last day. So this story about how these guys deserted their troops is just not true. There's some of the younger guys did, but the senior commanders mostly didn't. So what South Vietnam had was the same problem it always had, an enormous 800-mile long left flank that is almost impossible to defend. And they had the same problems that we'd always had, getting good intelligence on the enemy, knowing where they're massing, and then having the firepower and the reserves to stem those enemy attacks. And so the problem is that it wasn't that they couldn't stop the North Vietnamese, but they couldn't stop with a simultaneous countrywide offensive without US air power. The country is just too narrow in its width, at its waist, and they didn't have the reserves and the firepower to stop that initial attack and then counterattack. And that was their problem. That's why the 72 offensive got blunted, was because of the US air power backed them up enough, the guys on the ground. So the North Vietnamese decided to attack. They decided to attack Ba Me Tuot, which is a town in the southern central part of the Central Highlands, mainly because it's a weakly defended area and there are two good roads. There's a good road, Route 21, going right to the coast, and if you take that road and go right to the coast, you cut South Vietnam right in half. And so they massed essentially 3 divisions against about 1.5 battalions in the town, and it still took them 1.5 days to take it. And what happened is another battalion was holed up in an outfield outside of town, and they held off a combined armed assault for an entire week. Out of 350 men who started that battle, 30 made it back to the coast with their battalion commander, and they finally retreated a week later. Down in 3 Corps, the 31st Ranger Group was holding a town called Trung Tan, which is along Route 13, is An Loc, Trung Tan, and then going down towards Saigon. And they had the town essentially fortified position. They had moats, they had barbed wire fences, they had minefields, they had tanks dug in. And so a Ranger Group is essentially a regiment. They were slightly reinforced. They held off multiple tank-led assaults by the entire NVA 9th Division for several days, and were still holding, threw them out one time in hand-to-hand fighting, and were still holding the town until they were ordered to retreat. The 9th Division was so badly battered, it could not rejoin the fight until the very end, a month later, until it got reinforcements from North Vietnam. One of the most spectacular and unknown South Vietnamese feats of arms was the retreat of the 22nd Division from the An Khe Pass back to the coast. So in the initial attacks in March 75, the PAV 3rd Division had grabbed the An Khe Pass and was dug in. The ARVN 47th Regiment was holding there. They moved a couple of regiments up to try and take the pass. Once the retreat from the Central Highlands happened, the commanding general of the 22nd ordered these regiments to pull back. They made a fighting retreat. They were cut off 3 times. They broke through 3 roadblocks, moved their regiments all the way down to the beach, loaded their guys on the ships. One of the regiment commanders committed suicide on a beach. The other guy went south to Saigon and helped reform the division and spent 13 years in prison for his valor. It is one of the most impressive fighting retreats, if you're a study, I've ever seen. And then the last one down in 4 Corps, at Can Tho, which is the capital of the Mekong Delta, the ARVN 21st Division, which was universally rated as their worst division at that point in time, held off a couple of, the 4th Division, a couple other regiments attack, and so badly decimated them that there was no further main force attacks in the entire Mekong Delta for the rest of April. So, I'll speed this up a little bit, I'm running out of time here. So aid cuts is one of the main reasons why the South Vietnamese fell. In December of '73, the US Army told General Murray, who was the defense attaché at that time, to no further ammunition. General Murray went to Ambassador Martin, begged him to tell the South Vietnamese that they've got to stop using up ammunition and requesting supplies at the rate they've been doing. He refused to do it, thinking that he could convince the Pentagon and the Congress to reinstate the supplies. It didn't happen. And by March of '74, they are running out of supplies so badly that General Vienne had to cut the ammunition supply rate to each 105 gun 4 rounds a day, 2 rounds for 155. Soldiers going into combat were cut to 2 hand grenades and 80 rounds of M16 ammunition a week. And the VNAF sortie rate was cut so badly that they had to allocate them by month. And during the attacks in March, the commander in the Army commander in the 4 Corps used up the entire sortie rate for March and all of April defeating those attacks. And in fact, they would have been out of JP4 by early May if they had kept on going the way they were. And one of the key things that people don't think about is that economic aid cuts back. We all look at ammunition and think of ourselves as soldiers, we've got to have things that can shoot, move, and communicate. But the economic aid, which was paying their salaries in the government and in their soldiers, was just as devastating as the lack of military aid. And most of these guys, there was a study done in the 3rd ARVN Division, which is up in I Corps, that these guys, the average soldier was getting meat like once a month and seafood like a couple of times. They were living on rice and whatever they could scrounge up. It was just amazing. So the fourth myth. Most U.S. writers, again, because they were either in Saigon or not really paying attention to what was going on, wrote that the ARVN didn't put up much of a fight, especially in the last battle for Saigon, and that's totally not the case. So from the 5th of April to the 30th, NVA forces in 3 corps alone lost 3,500 dead. 3,500 dead, and 8,000 wounded. And for those of you who ever served with the Vietnamese Marines, and I'll talk about I Corps in a second, the Vietnamese Marines had tried to regroup at Vung Tau. They had enough guys that they were able to form 2 brigades. They put the 2 brigades essentially on a line on the eastern side of Saigon, and the 6th Marine Battalion was holding the town of Honai on Route 1, which is just to the east of Bien Hoa. Now, Lieutenant Colonel Le Ba Bin, who actually lives in San Jose, who's got a Silver Star and 2 Bronze Stars, was commanding the Vietnamese 6th Marine Battalion. He held that town against an assault by an armored force of the PAVN 341st Division. And he held that town, and the entire Marines, the Vietnamese Marines, basically lit up the whole North Vietnamese army until the Vietnamese were ordered to pull back across the Dong Nai River. So there are continual instances of the South Vietnamese fighting very desperately, but by this time they're almost out of ammunition, and they just don't have enough troops to cover the ground. And I thought, here's a couple of quotes that I thought were very instructive. You can see right there, sir, on that one. That even the North Vietnamese, and trust me when I say this, you find very few instances where the North Vietnamese military in their books or their interviews say anything nice about the South Vietnamese. So when they say something like this about the South Vietnamese, you know that the fighting was pretty tough. And one of my favorite at Tan Son Nhut Air Force, the 81st Airborne Rangers, which was the most elite force the South Vietnamese had, were holding the gates of Tan Son Nhut, and they knocked out 6 North Vietnamese tanks in the matter of about 10 minutes with laws and recoilless rifles up in buildings. And this is a comment from a PAVN general who talked about the fighting outside of Saigon and how fierce it was. So a few final notes. So this deep penetration attack against Tan Son Nhut Air Base was the largest armored strike of the war. They had amassed 2 regiments, 1 column each. They had about 25 armored vehicles in each column, regiment of infantry, sappers, artillery, anti-aircraft battalion, engineers, signal troops. The sappers went ahead, grabbed the bridges. Once they grabbed the bridges, they launched the deep penetration strike, just like a classic Soviet tank assault, right down Route 1 and hit right into Tan Son Nhut. There was nothing any one of you guys ever faced anywhere near this. And lastly, they essentially drained everything they had out of North Vietnam and sent everything south. They had almost all their air defense shield in South Vietnam. They left 1 division back, which is actually their best division, the 308, to guard Hanoi in case somebody tried something funny. And they had more troops in South Vietnam at the end than we had at the height of our period in early 1969. So as I said, I wanted just to cover those very briefly, those 4 myths about the fall, that the 8 cuts had hurt us, did not hurt the South Vietnamese military, very not true. That they collapsed easily, also not true. That they were cowards, also not true. And so I think that the book is really trying to set the historical record straight, that what you guys did in helping to build that country and helping to build that military was not in vain. That I think with steady American support after the war, that there was a more than even chance that South Vietnam could have survived. The problem is that they could not survive without American aid and American air power to back them up. The country, as you all know, was just not geographically able to be defended very easily. So. Having said all that, thank you for your time. I do want to show you one last thing. So once President Thieu pulled the Airborne Division pulled out of I Corps, General Trung had to reship and ship his forces, right? So Da Nang is more important than the ceasefire line. So once he pulled the Marines off the ceasefire line, The only troops he had left was a infantry RF group and a ranger group that was so badly decimated less than 300 men per battalion. So once they saw this, they basically came across, but the big thing is, what they were going to do was, they moved the 325th Division off the ceasefire line, looped it through the hills, down to the hill country, and put it next to the 324th Division. And what they did was, I'll put the map if you want to see it, was they pushed steadily south, but this was the key. And once they got 2 divisions down here against a couple of ranger groups in the first division, they cut Route 1 right here. Once they cut Route 1, all over the place. They tried to pull back to the ships and get to the harbor, and that's when the whole collapse happened. And then the Marine Brigade that was still sitting here, the 147th, pulled back, tried to get picked up by ships, and you read about what happened, but the Marine Brigade essentially died right there on the beach. The rest of them, the first division, the 2 RF groups, the Armor Brigade. It was a battle of Stalingrad proportion. Over 100,000 South troops captured and lost. Once Hue falls, General Trung tries to create an enclave around Da Nang. He pulls the 2nd Division, which is down here, to Chu Lai, tries to load them on ships, and they're a disaster. He pulls the 3rd Division and the Marines that are holding to the west of Da Nang back to try to hold a line from the Hai Van Pass down through Ho An, and it just turned into a rout. Because once the Marines and everybody started pulling back, the family started to flee, and you had 1 million refugees choking Route 1 and choking Da Nang. And what happens is all the troops just, what's called the family syndrome, they started looking for their people, their families, instead of defending their positions. And that's what happened to I Corps. Thank you very much. I hope this has been interesting for you. Looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Jay. That was very, very interesting and informative. I've got all sorts of little notes here. There's some redundancy, but and there's some I can't read. But there's a lot of good questions. I've got them sort of picked in terms of the most important and least important in case we run out of time. One of the first ones, I think, comes from Army retired. Said, why did the USA force, underlined, South Vietnam to accept the NVA keeping the ground that it captured in South Vietnam during the 1972 Easter offensive? It must have been seen as a kiss of death to the Army.
That's absolutely correct. In your second point, is this on? Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So the first point has to do with the Paris Peace Accords and what was negotiated by Dr. Kissinger in Paris. So once President Thieu was handed the draft of the Paris Peace Accord, which allowed the North Vietnamese troops to remain in South Vietnam, and you have to remember, we had already said in January of 1971 that we would withdraw and not request them to withdraw simultaneously, which had been the U.S. position up until January of 71. So once President Thieu saw that, he absolutely refused to sign the accords. President Nixon sent Dr. Kissinger back to Paris in November and late December to try to renegotiate. The North Vietnamese absolutely would not give in on that point. That was their bedrock principle. They were not going to withdraw their troops no matter what happened. So short of restarting the war, we had no choice, quote unquote, other than to accept this principle. We then forced the South Vietnamese to sign the accords with the secret promise that we would continue military aid and we would come back in militarily with firepower if the North Vietnamese launched a major military offensive.
Yeah, here's an interesting one. Not only did the North Vietnamese violate the Paris Peace Accord in the South, then they began to reinforce and to build up the Ho Chi Minh Trail just days after the accord was signed. To what extent did the U.S. know this, and if anything, did they do anything about it?
The answer is the U.S. absolutely knew that they were infiltrating down the Ho Chi Minh Trail through a variety of methods. There was still signals intelligence, there was still photo reconnaissance. Little known fact, the South Vietnamese had recon troops in Laos watching the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So I've got reams of documents that talk about the infiltration, and it got to the point where it was so serious, Kissinger recommended to President Nixon that we start bombing again. President Nixon said no. He wanted to wait until all the U.S. POWs were out before he started bombing again. And then once the American POWs came home at the end of March, it's now early April, President Chiu was visiting. He doesn't want to bomb because he doesn't want to be seen as bombing in response to Chiu coming over. Now it's mid-April, and all of a sudden Watergate is rearing its ugly head, and he no longer has the political clout to do something like that.
There's one that's not exactly about what you said, but about some of the impressions. Your books impressed me in that you seem to have a strong fascination with Vietnam. Have you ever visited Vietnam? Do you speak the language? What's the attraction to this conflict, and where do you find your connections?
I've never visited Vietnam. I don't speak Vietnamese. As I said, my friend is fluent in it, and he translated all the documents for me. I was always a student of military history, loved military history, and as I was telling somebody earlier that I got deeply involved in the POW-MIA issue, which if you study the POW-MIA issue in any depth, you can't understand that unless you understand the war and what was going on, and so one thing led to another.
Here's a brief one that's sort of related. Did the ARN, with the U.S. support, raid units in North Vietnam after the peace accord was signed?
No. Well, they didn't go into North Vietnam because by that time the North Vietnamese 72 offensive had left them sort of pushed back from the borders. The only real major South Vietnamese action was the Battle of Veith, which is up on the Dong Ha, on the river up there. They sent a Marine brigade, composite Marine brigade with some armor to try and take that town because the North Vietnamese had Dong Ha and they had the river, and they were going to build that into a river port. And so the South Vietnamese wanted to cut that off. So they went up there, they grabbed Veith right before the ceasefire happened, and Giap counterattacked with 2 regiments and drove them out.
This one I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. It's pretty long. It's aligned with our role in Afghanistan and our departure from them. It says, what lessons can we learn from the U.S. relationship with Vietnam from 72 to 75 as we disengaged our major combat role there as compared to doing so in Afghanistan now?
That's a fascinating question. I'll actually be writing an article for the American Legion magazine on this very point. But basically, I think the main thing was the psychological support to the South Vietnamese and concurrently to the Afghans is that we are not abandoning them. If there's still a residual American combat force there, something that's got a little teeth into it, and there's still ongoing American aid that's well targeted. As long as I think the Afghan people still think that they have us backing them, I think that will give them the strength to fight the Taliban. Because many of the South Vietnamese looked upon the North Vietnamese as going to be ultimate victors. There was so much propaganda that they were going to take over once the Americans left that a lot of them believed it. And once they started seeing the world abandon them and us abandon them, then that created a tremendous psychological shock to them and created the crack in morale.
Yeah, I think a lot of us understand that. Can you comment on Senator Ted Kennedy's cut off aid to the Republic of Vietnam when his brother JFK actually started the U.S.'s involvement in Vietnam?
Well, it wasn't just Kennedy, but he was certainly one of the ringleaders. There was a lot of Democrats who were pushing very hard for cutting off aid. And remember that at that time, both the Senate and the House were heavily Democratic. The 74 elections for the House had put the largest Democratic majority in the House in 100 years. And so there was a lot of people like Bella Abzug from New York who were leading the charge to cut aid to South Vietnam because why? South Vietnam was a dictatorship. And why should we support a dictatorship? The North Vietnamese are going to win, so why should we spend more money on these guys? So that was unfortunate, the view of the Congress.
And that carried.
And that carried quite a bit, yes.
This one is, I think, very interesting, but it's very brief as well. Fall of South Vietnam. inevitable from the beginning? From 1950 on, French experience. Make any sense to you?
I think the question is, was the fall of South Vietnam inevitable? Well, that's the great historical question, I guess. There are many people in sort of the left of the academic view who would say the answer to that is yes. I'm of the belief that the answer to that is no, but it now comes down to a matter of opinion.
And I remember reading this, the U.S. government who assured Vietnamese were able to work, and again I'm paraphrasing, for the U.S. government that we would take care of them if things turned bad. And there were still hundreds of Vietnamese inside the compound when word came from Washington that no more helicopter flights were allowed and the Viets inside the embassy were left behind. Was this because of our leaders did not want to be forced back into the war, or was it because of the danger of our evacuation aircraft?
It was a combination of the Marine helicopter pilots had been flying for hours. They were exhausted. There was poor communication from the embassy once they had crashed some of the communication gear. So what they were seeing in Washington was this continual stream of helicopters having to go back and forth to the fleet, and what seemed like this endless stream of people being picked up. So at some point, the President Ford and the National Security Council made a decision to just halt the helicopter flights, especially when that one Marine helicopter crashed in the ocean. They didn't want to risk the pilots. They didn't want to risk anymore, and they just, at that point, they didn't know what's going on the ground well enough to make a decision. So there was 432 people still in the embassy to be cleared out, and those people were left behind because they cut those helicopter flights off about one lift too late, or early, I should say.
And sort of a correlation to that, but more on a strategic level, knowing what we now know, was the decision to depend by the U.S. government, depend on South Vietnamese government to defend their country, logical. Did we think they could defend the country?
I don't think any Vietnamese or American general thought that the South Vietnamese could defend their country against a major communist offensive without U.S. air power and firepower on either side. But if you're talking about an average battle, yes, they could defend. But against a major communist offensive, which is defined as 3 of the 4 regions being embroiled in heavy attacks, without U.S. firepower, no.
There's another question that sort of correlates to that I don't need to read, but did the South Vietnamese still hold out hope that the U.S. air support would ever resume?
They absolutely did. Despite, every indication not, up until General Huyen's trip in early April of 75, President Thieu and General Vienne were desperately asking for American B-52 strikes. And if we had even put naval gunfire against what's called the coastal column, which was this 202,000 vehicle column coming down Route 1, we could have decimated them, but because they were bunched up and open on the Chi Minh Trail. But once Congress cut off they passed the Church-Cooper Amendment that no U.S. Military forces would be engaged in Southeast Asia. That was it. If President Ford would have said, yes, I'm going to do it, he'd have been violating the law and could have been impeached.
Your books impressed me, particularly and so this is sort of my question, and that you seem to have a strong fascination with Vietnam. Have you ever visited there? Do you speak the language? What's the attraction? The real thing is, what's the attraction to the conflict? You're spending so much time, and I've read through all 3 of your books, and you're starting another one.
Right.
And you're younger than me by a whole bunch. So you weren't there when I was, unless you had some in your mouth. But if you, why are you dedicated to this? I have an idea, but I'd like to get your response.
I think it's a war that has been badly, I don't want to say reported, but looked at from a historical point of view. It was so politicized. There are so many people who, on the anti-war side, have managed to grab a hold of and keep the nature of what's called the historiography of the war, and they're saying X, Y, and Z happened. But when you start talking to the Vietnamese, you start talking to vets like you see that X, Y, and Z just doesn't pan out. Doesn't match reality. So there's only a handful of us, I would say, on the sort of the revisionist side who have struggled, I think, to tell the truth, not only about what was really going on in Vietnam, but what was really going on with the South Vietnamese, which is a whole different story that most Americans don't know. And that's what I'm really trying to portray is a balanced view of our allies. They were not, as I said, the second coming of the Waffen SS, but they weren't these incompetent bumblers either. You've got to, if you're going to talk bad about them, and there's a lot of things to talk bad about them, you also got to say, you know, when they did good, and they did good in lots of places. So to me, it's just being fair and balanced and teaching and showing the history as it really happened and not through a political lens.
Okay, that's all of the written echoing, but I was going to ask if someone to raise their hand. I can see it right now.
Frank Cambria, could you say a word or two about Soon Lop?
Yes.
Former 11th Cav headquarters.
All right, so the Battle of Soon Lop in April of 1975. The town of Soon Lop was held by the ARVN 18th Division. General Layman Dow, who was actually a very good friend of mine. I wrote a very detailed article, and it's also in my book. So the ARVN 18th Division basically was holding the town. On the 9th of April, they were attacked by an entire NVA Corps, 3 divisions. And they basically held that town and turned it into a blood-drenched killing ground. They caused 2,000 dead in 2 days. And Dow held the town, and it's probably South Vietnam's biggest victory in the last part of the war, until he was ordered to retreat. And then he made a really masterful retreat straight south down Route 2 and pulled his division all the way out and swung it back around to Long Binh. So that battle is probably South Vietnam's shining moment in the last offensive. Are there numbers on you on ARVN South Vietnamese killed in action? And your comment about the North Vietnamese at 300,000 is actually off by a factor of 1/3. So the North Vietnamese have just recently released how many dead they took. It was 972,000 casualties in the war, dead. The South Vietnamese numbers, I have to go back and add them up, but they were the two major years, 68 and 72, were 32,000 and 28,000, and in 73 was about 18,000, 74 was about 25,000, and no one knows how many died in 75. The ARVN officers who were withdrawing at the very end were staff officers in the Saigon commands. Most of the combat officers were still in the ring around Saigon. Anybody who had been in command was no longer, like for General Trung and General Lam Quang Thi, who commanded I Corps Forward, they were no longer in command of troops. They were essentially assigned to the headquarters at that point. So yes, you're right, there were a lot of guys getting out, but we were also getting a lot of guys out because they were high risk categories. A lot of those guys would have been either shot or sent to long-term re-education camps. So we were pulling a lot of those guys out too. But most of the guys you probably saw getting out were staff officers, not combat officers. So there was, I don't think it's a true comment, but supposedly General Giap said in reference to an interview by a man named Stephen Young that in reference to the 1972 Christmas bombing, if we had gone on another week, that they would have had to surrender. And they were, in fact, and this is kind of a key point, they were out of assembled SAM missiles. They weren't out of assembled, they weren't out of parts, they were out of assembled SAM missiles. But they were also bringing on a SAM-3 regiment. But anyways, supposedly he said that, but I would find it very difficult to believe that based on what he's written after the war.
The author wants to sign some books over there, and that's going to take some time as well. So let's reluctantly thank him very, very much for what he's doing. We're going to have to quit, but please give your applause to this very, very, very